What happens if you cry out in pain in this galaxy? The question burns itself into me like a brand. I cannot escape it. I have lived long enough to know the answer, to see the consequences painted in blood and silence across the endless cities of the Imperium, yet still the thought gnaws at me. What happens when a human voice, fragile and trembling, dares to break the sanctioned silence? What happens when the body's instinct overpowers the weight of discipline, when flesh betrays spirit and a scream escapes? In the hive where I was born, sound was rationed more strictly than food, more harshly than water. The manufactorum drones never ceased their thunder. The machines sang in shrieks of iron and steam. The voxcasters chanted their endless hymns of the Emperor's glory. Noise filled every crevice, but none of it belonged to us. The one thing never permitted was the human voice, raw and uncontained. To speak without cause was dangerous. To cry out was worse. I remember the corridors most clearly. Long, narrow veins cut into the body of the hive, walls sweating condensation, pipes dripping brown water that tasted of rust. Lumen strips buzzed with half-life above, flickering so often they gave the illusion of movement in the dark. The floor was ferrocrete, cracked and stained, every inch of it bearing the imprint of generations of trudging boots. The air was heavy with smog and the stale tang of recycled breath, pressing into the lungs like damp cloth. We moved through those corridors in lines, always lines, to the work shift from the work shift. Marching without thought, bound to routine as tightly as any chain. Voices were forbidden, eyes stayed down. We became shadows of one another, faceless and mute. It was on such a march that I heard it, the first scream. At first I thought it was a machine rupturing, some gear tearing itself loose or a pressure valve failing under strain. It had that same jagged violence, that same raw edge of tearing. But no machine made that sound. It was human, unmistakably human. A man ahead of me had faltered. I saw his form stumble, collapsing against the wall. A shard of metal, rusted and jagged, had pierced through his work cloak, tearing into his side. Blood seeped quickly, too quickly, pooling on the floor in dark stains. And then he screamed. It was not a defiant cry. It was not even loud in comparison to the machines. But in the silence of the march, in the world of swallowed words, the sound was cataclysmic. It tore the air open. It vibrated through my bones. It felt obscene, a sin carved into the air. Heads turned. They always turn. It is instinct, but it is also condemnation. The others looked at him not with pity, not with compassion, but with something colder. Disgust. Terror. It was as if the sound itself had infected him, transformed him into something alien. No one reached to help him. Their faces hardened, became stone. I remember my own body betraying me. My gut twisted. My heart stuttered in my chest. The scream was not mine, yet it filled me as if it had been dragged out of my own throat. I wanted him to stop. Emperor, forgive me, I wanted him to stop. The air changed. I swear it did. The moment that cry left his throat, it was as if unseen things stirred, as though the corridor itself had ears and they had been waiting. I felt the walls lean in, listening. The shadows deepened, stretching along the floor like grasping fingers. We all froze. Even the overseer behind us went still, whip held in his hand like a serpent waiting to strike. The man's cry echoed, ragged and helpless, spilling weakness across the stone. And then silence. I did not see who struck the blow. Perhaps the overseer silenced him with a lash, perhaps a fellow worker desperate to erase the sound. Perhaps the hive itself reached out and swallowed him. All I remember is the scream cutting off, sudden and absolute, like a wire being torn from a wall. The silence that followed was heavier than iron. It pressed into me, into all of us. The absence of the sound was worse than the sound itself. My ears rang with its ghost, with the memory of it. My chest felt hollow, scraped out by the void it left behind. We did not look back. We did not break the line. We kept moving, boots striking the ferrocrete in rhythm, as if nothing had happened. That is how it always is. I never saw that man again. His absence was not noted, not recorded. He vanished into the cracks of the hive as if he had never existed. The work quotas did not change. His rations were reallocated. His life was nothing, his scream even less. But to me, it was everything. That was the day I learned what a cry means in this galaxy. It is not a call for aid. It is not a plea for compassion. It is a signal flare, a beacon, a wound torn into the fabric of silence, and wounds attract predators. I learned that to cry out is to invite something in, to make yourself visible to powers you must never see, to ears that must never hear you. And most of all, I learned this: a scream is never wasted. It is always answered. I once thought silence was safety, that if we kept our voices buried and our pain hidden, the world would pass over us, blind and deaf to our suffering. But in the Imperium, you are never alone. Not truly. Everywhere there are ears, some human, most not. The first time I understood this, I was still young, still foolish enough to believe that suffering was private, that one man's cry could vanish into the thunder of the machines, that the hive was too vast, too indifferent to notice the pain of a single soul. I was wrong. The worker's name was Corvin. At least I think it was. Names blur over time in the hive. They fade the way faces fade. But I remember the moment clearly. The great conveyor belts ran like rivers of iron, dragging half-finished casings into the depths of the manufactorum. Corvin was stationed too close. Perhaps his concentration slipped. Perhaps exhaustion dulled his reflexes. In the end, it did not matter. The belt swallowed his hand. I heard the sound of it, flesh and bone dragged into grinding teeth of steel. And then, before he could stop himself, before he could bite it down, Corvin screamed. The noise was ragged, wet with terror. It rose above the din of industry, above the chants of devotion blaring from the Vox speakers. For one heartbeat it carried, a sound that was wrong, too human, too fragile, cutting across the sanctioned rhythms of machine and him. I remember the way we all froze, heads bent lower, eyes fixed on the ground. Not one of us turned to look, not one of us moved to help. His scream was his own crime. To witness it was dangerous, to acknowledge it was complicity. But what chilled me most was not his pain, it was the speed. The overseers arrived within moments, too fast, faster than they should have, given the depth of the manufactorum, the distance of their patrols. As though summoned, as though guided. Their boots struck the metal with precision, their visors already locked on him before the echoes of his scream had faded. They dragged him away, leaving only blood smeared across the conveyor edge, dripping in slow rivulets. No one spoke. No one asked where he went. We knew, but in my heart I knew something more. I knew they should not have come so quickly. No mortal ear could have cut through the machinery so fast. No human patrol could have moved with such unnatural certainty. It was as if something else had heard, something that should not have ears. And so I learned, the Imperium listens. Always. It listens through the Vox lines, endlessly transmitting prayers and orders, but also recording, always recording. It listens through pick captures buried in walls, their lenses black and watching, crusted with the soot of centuries but still alive. It listens through the servitors that wander the corridors, their augmetics whirring, their blank eyes sweeping, their ears not ears at all but sensors tied to networks beyond our comprehension. And there are other listeners, those that press against the veil, those that hunger for sound, for fear, for pain. A cry is not just heard by men, it travels further, deeper, into places no voice should reach. I have felt it. When a scream rises, something shifts in the air, a static prickle across the skin, like unseen breath crawling down the back of your neck. The Vox units crackle with distortion. Shadows twitch, though the lumen strips burn steady. The fabric between here and there grows thin. It is not always demons. Sometimes it is worse. Sometimes it is the Emperor's own agents. The black-clad enforcers, the sanctioned psychers, the whispering priests who descend not because of what they see, but because of what they hear. A cry is like a confession dragged into the open. Once it escapes, it belongs to them. I remember Corvin's face as they dragged him past me. His eyes were wide, pleading, but his mouth was still open, blood running from where he had bitten his tongue in half. As though he realized, too late, the magnitude of his crime. His scream had marked him, lit him like a beacon. His pain was no longer his own. That is the truth of this place. Nothing belongs to you. Not your labor, not your time, not your body, not even your voice. Especially not your voice. Paranoia became my companion after that. I learned to listen for the listeners, to notice the faint red glow of a hidden lens in a corner, to mark the way a servitor's head lingered too long, its augmetics whirring as it processed some private judgment, to feel the way the very air shifted when silence was broken. Sometimes, when the work shifts ended and I lay in my hab cell, I would hear it faint tapping, as if claws traced along the venting ducts above my head, or whispers carried through the vox static, words too faint to understand but heavy with intent. I told myself it was imagination, that the hive itself groaned and whispered in its age. But in my bones I knew the truth. The cry of pain is a door. Once opened, you do not choose who passes through. Corvin's disappearance haunted me for years. No body returned, no ashes to scatter, simply absence. The overseers never mentioned him again, but in their silence was an unspoken lesson. If you scream, they will know. If you reveal your weakness, something will come. Something always comes. And so we learned to lock it inside, to swallow the sound, to bite our tongues until blood filled our mouths, to clench our jaws until our teeth cracked. Better to be silent and broken than to cry out and be taken. But silence is no shield. I would learn that soon enough. For in the Imperium, weakness is not forgiven, and others forgive it even less. Silence is survival. That is what I told myself after Corvin was taken. Bite back the pain, swallow the cry, lock every sound inside your throat until even your own blood forgets how to weep. But silence is not enough, for the Imperium is not blind. Its eyes are everywhere, and they are sharper than its ears. I learned this truth not in the Manufactorum, but on the battlefield. I had been pressed into service, as so many are. A conscription notice arrived, stamped with the sigil of our governor, soaked in the seal of the administratum. There was no refusal, no exemption. The tithe demanded flesh, and my flesh was counted. We were herded into transports like cattle, our bodies pressed together, our heads shaved to stubble. The air was thick with incense and litanies. Chaplains stalked the aisles, chanting prayers of fortitude, their voices hoarse and merciless. We were not men, they told us. We were weapons, tools. Faith was our steel, silence our armor. And yet I still believed silence was enough. It was during our first engagement that the illusion died. I can still smell it. The scorched ozone from Lasfair, the acrid tang of promethium smoke, the metallic bite of blood misting in the air. The enemy had broken through the outer trench lines, and we were rushed forward, barely trained, barely armed, but already condemned to stand or fall in his name. The man beside me was young, too young. His armor hung loose upon him, and his lasgun trembled in his grip. His name is gone from me now, but his face remains pale, round, almost boyish. He had not yet learned how to hide fear behind a mask of stone. When the enemy's fire swept across our line, he was struck. A glancing las burn across his ribs. It was not mortal. It did not even knock him down. But the pain must have been fire in his flesh, for he staggered, and from his lips came a sound. Not a scream, not even a cry, just a whimper, fragile and small. A child's sound in a war zone of iron and death. And that was enough. The commissar heard. He was a dark figure, looming above us at the trench's edge. His greatcoat flared as he moved, his boots sinking into mud and blood alike. The aquila gleamed on his cap, and in his hand was the bolt pistol, a weapon more feared than the enemy's guns. The boy turned, pleading. His lips trembled, words of apology spilling, words of faith half-formed. But the commissar did not hesitate. The pistol rose. The crack of the shot was louder than the Lasfair, louder than the bombardments. It punched through the air, and the boy's head snapped back, his whimper silenced in an instant. His body collapsed, smoke rising from the ruin of his skull. No one else made a sound. I remember my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, the iron taste of bile choking my throat. I wanted to scream, not from pain but from horror, but I buried it. I buried it so deep I thought I would suffocate on the silence. The commissar's voice carried over us then, cold, final. The Emperor hears no cowards, fight or die. And we fought not from courage, not from faith, but from fear of that pistol, from fear of what silence broken would cost us. That was the lesson. Pain is not private. Pain is not weakness alone. Pain is betrayal. To cry out is to reveal that you are unfit, unfit to labor, unfit to serve, unfit to believe. And in the Imperium, the unfit are cut away, like rot from the flesh. The creed is drilled into us from birth. A child who weeps is beaten until the tears stop. A worker who groans at the weight of his burden is whipped until his back runs red. A soldier who flinches is shot as an example. To endure is holy. To break is heresy. Cruelty wears the mask of necessity. That is what they tell us. Without iron discipline, there is only collapse. Without silence, there is only chaos. Without the purging of weakness, there is only corruption, and corruption means damnation. And so we learn to devour our cries, to bite down on our tongues until we taste copper, to drive nails of silence into our throats until even agony cannot escape. But silence is no sanctuary. I began to see it in the eyes of those around me, in the trenches, in the factories, in the endless labor camps. Men and women staring straight ahead, their jaws clenched, their expressions like carved stone. But behind the eyes I saw it. The scream still lived, not out loud, not in sound, but inside, boiling, breaking. I saw it drive some to madness, to spasms in their sleep, to bloodied fingernails clawing at their own flesh, to sudden violence without warning. The silence breaks them from within because pain demands to be voiced, and when it cannot, it festers like infection in the soul. I knew then the true cruelty of the Imperium. It is not only that it punishes weakness, it is that it forces you to cage weakness inside yourself, to become your own jailer, your own executioner. The commissar's pistol is mercy compared to that. I have felt it myself, the fracture lines forming, the silence splitting like glass under pressure. My teeth ache from grinding, my throat burns from swallowing every cry, every word. I feel the scream in me even now, coiled and waiting, a serpent twisting in my chest. And so I confess, silence is not safety, because silence itself can be broken. And when it breaks, it will not be the ears of others that destroy me. It will be the sound that comes from within. Silence was not safety. I had learned that truth in the trenches when a boy's whimper cost him his life. But I soon learned something darker still. Silence was not merely demanded, it was designed. The Imperium does not leave suffering to chance. It forges it, molds it, builds it into the bones of its people as carefully as a fortress wall or a cathedral spire. Pain is not endured, it is engineered. I saw it first in the Manufactoria, long before the front lines. Servoskulls drifted above the rows of laborers, their lenses glowing red, their vox grills clicking softly like the whisper of insects. They listened to every breath. They measured each pause in motion, every faltering heartbeat. Their sensors could detect the tremor of a hand, the tightening of a throat before a cry. And when such weakness was found, the punishment came swift. Shock prods cracked against flesh. Not enough to kill, never enough for release, but always enough to remind. Pain was not only consequence, it was currency, a tax on hesitation. The strike did not need to leave a scar. The lesson was the scar, but it was under the Arbites where the machinery revealed its full design. I was taken once, though I still do not know why. Perhaps a misfiled record, perhaps a word overheard and twisted, perhaps no reason at all. In the Imperium, guilt is not proven, it is assumed. And so their boots thundered down the hab corridor, their mauls slammed against my door, an iron hand seized me in the night. The cell was stone, black and damp, though whether it was underground or in some fortress spire I could not tell. My wrists were bound in manacles that chafed until blood seeped. There was no light but a single lumen globe, suspended on a chain, swaying slightly, casting shadows like blades across the wall. And waiting for me there was not chaos, not madness, but order, cold, calculated order. The arbitrator spoke without passion. His words were not cruel, not mocking. They were as flat and precise as a data slate. Your voice belongs to the Emperor. It does not belong to you. You may not spend it on cries, nor waste it on pleas. If you do, you will have committed heresy against him whose breath fills your lungs. Then the blows began. They were not frenzied, they were measured. A strike to the ribs, a pause, a strike to the mouth, another pause. The rhythm was exact like the ticking of a chronometer. The pain was sharp, bright, each impact carefully placed to ignite nerves but avoid collapse. They wanted endurance, not death. Blood pooled in my mouth, copper flooding my tongue. My vision swam and the lumen above me wavered like a dying star. My body begged for release, for a cry, a shout, a single ragged scream. But the voice in my mind, the voice drilled since birth, chained me. To cry out was to betray him. To betray him was to die. So I swallowed the sounds. I swallowed until my throat burned with silence more than blood. The arbitrator leaned close, his face half hidden by his carapace helm, the aquila embossed upon its brow. His breath smelled of incense and oil. "Good," he said softly, as if I were not a prisoner but a pupil. "The Emperor is pleased with your silence." I do not know how long it lasted. Hours, perhaps, or days. Time does not exist in the cell. Only the cycle of strike, pause, strike again. My body became a machine of endurance, nothing more. My mind emptied until there was only silence, a silence so deep I thought it might consume me from within. That was their goal, to hollow us, to make us vessels not of faith alone but of obedience. Pain was their tool, silence their measure. They believed the Emperor listened, and that every sound of weakness was an offense against his throne. And yet, even in that chamber, built to break us into mute submission, silence was not unbroken. Because someone screamed, it was not me. The sound ripped through the stone like a blade. It was raw, ragged, desperate, not a whimper, not a cry, but a scream that tore the air apart. For a heartbeat, I did not know whether it came from outside or inside my skull. It carried such force, such horror, that the lumen above seemed to flicker in fear. The arbitrator froze. His measured rhythm halted. His visor turned, listening. And in that instant I realized the machine had faltered. Someone somewhere in this fortress of silence had broken. The scream did not last. It was cut short. Whether by blade, by bolt, or by the final collapse of a throat torn raw, I never learned. But the echo lived on. It reverberated in the stone, in the marrow of my bones, in the very air I breathed. And it haunted me more than the blows, more than the silence. Because in that moment I understood it was possible to break, and one day it might be me. The scream should have ended with silence. That is how it was meant to be. A cry rises, the arbitrators descend, and discipline is restored in the shape of bruises and broken teeth. Such things were expected, accounted for, absorbed into the daily rhythm of punishment. But this scream was not ordinary. It lingered. It clawed the air like a living thing, stretching beyond lungs, beyond flesh, echoing far longer than the throat that birthed it. And in its wake the silence felt wrong, too heavy, too deep. The lumen globe above my head quivered on its chain. Its glow faltered as though the scream had brushed against the filament itself. The shadows along the stone walls did not return to stillness. They swayed. They bent as though stirred by a wind that did not exist. I told myself it was nothing, a trick of exhaustion, a fracture in my bloodied skull, but my heart did not believe the lie. It raced, it thundered, and in its thunder I felt the answer something had heard. The arbitrator stood frozen. His measured ritual of strikes and pauses had faltered, broken not by my silence but by that alien cry. His carapace helm turned fractionally, listening. The vox grill at his throat crackled, though no words emerged. Then the others came, boots on stone, keys jangling, the heavy swing of a reinforced door. I could not see them, my head was bowed, my vision blurred with sweat and blood, but I heard the beating begin. Flesh on flesh, the crack of bone against metal, the scream choked, faltered, rose again. It became less a voice than a tearing sound, as though the lungs themselves were being ripped apart. I should have felt relief, that the attention was turned elsewhere, that my silence spared me, but I did not. I felt only dread, because with every cry the air grew heavier, denser. The lumen flickered again, once, twice, and then it rippled. The light stretched unnaturally, shadows bending like wax under heat. The chains that bound my wrists shivered as if touched by an unseen hand. I smelled something acrid, something that did not belong to stone or sweat or blood, like burning copper, like spoiled incense. The scream had become a signal, and something was answering. For a heartbeat I thought I saw it, not with my eyes but with something deeper. The walls bulged inward as if they were not walls at all but thin parchment and something pressed against them from the other side. Shapes without form, faces without skin. They twisted, straining to break through, their mouths opening in silence that mirrored our enforced silence, mouths that promised that if they broke through, silence would never exist again. The arbitrators did not see, or they refused to. Their blows fell harder, faster, desperate now, as though they sensed on some buried level what their discipline had summoned. Their voices rose, reciting the litanies of punishment, their words colliding with the screams in a storm of sound. But I felt it. The veil was thin. And in that thinness, something vast pressed close, closer than breath. For the first time since my youth, I thought of the sermons whispered in the Schola, how pain feeds the enemy, how cries in the dark call out like beacons in the warp. I had believed them to be warnings, metaphors wrapped in fire and scripture. But here in this stone chamber I knew they were not metaphors. The warp listens, and sometimes it answers. I closed my eyes. I bit my tongue until blood drowned my throat. I begged silently, not for mercy, not for release, but for silence. That no sound should leave me, that my voice remain his and his alone. But still the prisoner screamed, and still the walls shook. The shadows thickened into shapes almost tangible, and for an instant I swore one of them turned its head and looked at me. No eyes, no face, just the weight of attention, heavier than chains, colder than stone. I wanted to believe it was madness, that the blows to my head had ruptured something vital, that the blood loss had poisoned my sight. I wanted to believe the warp had not bent close to us, had not smelled the offering of agony and reached out a claw to taste it. But belief is a fragile thing in the Imperium. I heard the final cry, short, sharp, and then nothing. The prisoner had broken. Whether into death or silence I cannot say. The shadows withdrew. The air grew lighter. The lumen steadied, though its glow seemed weaker than before, as though some part of it had been drained. The arbitrators resumed their rhythm. Their world had returned to order, but mine had not, because I remembered the smell of copper, the press of unseen hands, the gaze that had fallen upon me in the dark, and I knew. It had not been nothing, it had been something, and if it had been something, then it could return. That night when they dragged me back to my hab cell, I lay on the cot with blood drying on my skin and silence pressed tight against my lips. But in my mind I still heard it, the scream, the answer, and I could not decide which was worse. The body is not loyal. I had always believed that faith was a fortress, that if one's mind was iron, one's flesh would obey. That if I whispered the prayers of the creed often enough, if I steeped myself in litany and obedience, then the body would be mastered, beaten into silence just as the Imperium beats its subjects into obedience. But I was wrong. Flesh is treacherous. Flesh hungers, flesh weakens, flesh screams. And when it screams, it does not ask your permission. I have seen it in the bunkers, in the manufactoria, in the cells where men are reduced to shadows of themselves. I have seen soldiers bite through their own tongues, letting blood flood their mouths until they drowned on copper just to keep from letting sound escape. I have seen workers shove filthy, oil-soaked rags between their teeth, smothering themselves, suffocating until their eyes bulged red, all to deny their own flesh the luxury of voice. I have seen priests, zealots, holy men of the ministorum, take blades to their own throats and cut out their vocal cords, leaving only scars where once words of worship had flowed. And yet still the body betrays. A whimper, a gasp, a sob pulled from lungs that no oath can restrain. I once told myself I would never fail in such a way, that I would hold silence no matter the cost, that the Emperor himself would be my lock and my chain, and nothing, no torment, no fracture of bone, no tearing of flesh could force my voice from me. But pride is fragile and pain is endless. I remember the moment clearly. I have endured so much since, and time has blurred the edges of memory. But this wound is too deep to fade. The chains dug into my wrists, my bones were already cracked. My ribs screamed every time I drew breath. The lash fell again and again, its barbs tearing not only skin but muscle. And though I prayed, though I clenched my teeth so hard that two of them shattered in my jaw, still the sound came. Not a scream, not even a cry, just a whimper, small, weak, pathetic. It slipped out of me like poison, And when it did, the world changed. The arbitrators heard, of course. They always listen. And they smiled behind their masks. I could not see it, but I felt it, the shift in their rhythm, the cruel delight in their renewed strikes. They had cracked me. My silence, which had been my shield, my last dignity, had failed. And now I was nothing more than a body that could be toyed with, wrung of sound like a broken instrument. But worse than them were the others, the prisoners, my brothers in chains. I had thought foolishly that they would understand, that they who endured the same blows, who suffered the same darkness, might hear that sound and see not weakness but humanity, that my voice, broken though it was, might echo their own buried voices. I was wrong. They looked at me, not with pity, not with sorrow, but with disgust. Their faces twisted, not against the arbitrators, but against me. Because in that place pain is not shared, it is not a bond, it is a weapon. Each cry, each falter is a chance for another to step higher on the endless ladder of survival. Silence is strength, a scream is surrender, and those who surrender are despised, not pitied. I had given them reason to despise me. I remember the man to my left. His eye was swollen shut, his jaw broken. Yet when I whimpered, he spat blood at my feet. The woman to my right, her arm twisted at an unnatural angle, turned her head away, as though she could not bear to breathe the same air as me. Even the boy at the end, barely more than 15 winters, lowered his eyes in shame, as though my sound had stained us all. That look, that contempt was worse than any lash. It hollowed me. It made me wish they would kill me, just so I would not have to see those eyes again. I tried to speak then, to explain, to beg, but nothing came. My throat had closed itself as though it too now despised me. Only tears fell, and tears in that place are another betrayal, another weakness. I had become an example not of endurance, not of faith, but of failure. And in the Imperium, failure does not belong to the self alone. It spreads. It poisons. For the arbitrators did not only beat me after that. They beat the others too. They whispered into their ears that it was my fault, that my weakness had drawn the lash heavier upon them. And they believed it. Because in truth, they wanted to believe it. It gave them a reason to hate me, to distance themselves from me, to make themselves stronger by comparison. And so my voice, that single pathetic whimper, became not mine alone to bear. It was theirs as well. Their punishments grew harsher, their nights longer, their food rations thinner, and in their eyes all of it was my doing. I carried that weight more heavily than the chains. It ate me from within. It whispered in every prayer I spoke thereafter. It poisoned every attempt at redemption. Because I had learned the truth, the body is treacherous. It will fail you when you need it most. And when it fails, the price is not paid by you alone. I have spoken before of my failure, the moment when my body betrayed me, when a whimper slipped past my lips, thin and broken, yet loud enough to be heard. I thought foolishly that the punishment would fall upon me alone, that the weight of my weakness would be mine to bear. I had not yet learned the full cruelty of justice in this place, nor the twisted meaning of mercy beneath the emperor's gaze. The silence that followed my cry was not silence at all. It was a suspension, a vacuum where even the groan of rusting pipes and the shuffle of boots ceased. The guards froze. The prisoners froze. My own lungs froze. For the space of a heartbeat, the entire hall of stone and steel listened to the sound I had made, and the echo of it seemed to hang in the damp air, swollen with shame. Then came the voice of the overseer. It was not raised. It did not need to be. His tone was flat like parchment smoothed beneath an iron hand, without anger, without pity. He did not curse me. He did not lash me. He did not strike me. Instead, he lifted his last pistol from his belt with the same calm that one might lift a quill to inscribe a record in the archives. He turned and aimed not at me but into the sea of bodies around me. The shot cracked like lightning, splitting the heavens. I flinched. Others did not. They had expected it. I had not. The man he chose was no one to me, a laborer. His face was raw with grime, his shoulders slumped from endless work. I had seen him in passing, no more. His name, if I had ever known it, is gone to me now. All that remains is the moment the overseer's last bolt tore into his gut, and the way his body convulsed as though the very air had betrayed him. He did not die quickly. That was the point. The shot was placed low, deliberate, not the heart, not the skull. No mercy of swiftness. The overseer wanted him to bleed, to stagger, to choke and writhe. He wanted me to watch. He wanted all of us to watch. I remember the man's mouth opening wide, but no words came at first, only a ragged gasp that clawed its way into the stillness. Then came the sound, not the scream I had made, not the whimper of a coward, but the sound of lungs filling with blood. A wet, bubbling gurgle that grew louder with each breath, until it seemed the walls themselves were suffocating with him. His hands clawed at the wound, crimson running between his fingers, staining the floor in sluggish rivers. He fell to his knees. He did not curse the overseer. He did not curse me. He only struggled, desperate animal, as every instinct in his body demanded survival, even as life fled him. I could not look away. I wanted to. I wanted to close my eyes, to press my face into the filth of the floor and pretend it was not my fault. But the overseer's gaze was on me. I felt it like a weight, pressing me upright, forcing me to bear witness. If I turned away, if I dared to shut out the spectacle, I feared I would be next. So I watched as the man thrashed. Watched as his lips quivered and the first spray of scarlet spilled down his chin. Watched as his eyes bulged, filled with terror and the pleading question of why me. A question I could not answer. A question I knew had been meant for me all along. Minutes passed. Minutes that stretched into an eternity of choking and spasms. No one moved to help him. No one dared. This was not a death to be shared. It was mine, my punishment carried by another's flesh. His agony was the reflection of my cowardice. His blood was the ink in which my failure was recorded. When at last he collapsed, twitching in a widening pool of crimson, the smell of iron filled the chamber. Thick, cloying, sweet. It clung to the back of my throat until I nearly gagged. His eyes rolled toward me even in death, as if the last imprint his soul left upon the world was the brand of accusation upon my skin. The overseer holstered his weapon. Nothing more was said. Nothing needed to be. The lesson had been carved into all of us. I thought the torment ended with his death. I thought my shame would fade with the silence that returned. But in the days that followed, I learned the punishment was deeper still. The others began to look at me differently. At first, only glances. Quick, sharp, heavy with meaning. Then came the avoidance. Where once men pressed close together for warmth in the cold barracks, now there was space around me, a gulf where no body dared rest against mine. I was not beaten. I was not cursed aloud. That would have been mercy. That would have been a chance at absolution. No, I was marked in a quieter way, more insidious. They looked upon me as one looks upon a wound that festers, a rot that spreads if touched. It was not the overseer's bullet that condemned me. It was their eyes. I saw in them not pity, not anger, but fear. As though weakness were a contagion, as though my cry could infect their flesh, their endurance, their chance to survive another day. To them I was not merely a man who had faltered. I was a risk, a liability, a disease, and in truth they were not wrong. For here mercy does not exist as men think of it. The emperor does not grant release. He does not ease suffering. His mercy is endurance, and endurance alone. To cry out is to defy that mercy, to spit upon the endurance gifted to us. And so the burden must be paid, not by the sinner alone, but by all. One voice raised in weakness demands another body be silenced in blood. That is the arithmetic of survival here. That is the economy of pain. And I had become the reminder of it, walking among them like a shadow of contagion. Sometimes when I closed my eyes at night, I heard again the gurgling breath of the man who had died for me, the bubbling in his chest, the slow collapse of his body. I felt his stare boring into me, unrelenting, as though the grave itself had not swallowed his accusation. And in those moments, I hated myself with a venom deeper than words can convey. I told myself I would never cry out again. That no matter what was done to me, no matter how fire and steel tore my body apart, I would keep my silence. But in truth, it was not strength that bound my lips. It was terror. Terror of what my weakness could cost the others. Terror of seeing another body collapse because of me. And yet in the corners of my mind, another thought festered. That perhaps my failure had done more than mark me. Perhaps it had opened something. Perhaps the warp itself had listened as it had before, and in my weakness found not just prey but permission. I began to wonder if the others avoided me not only for fear of contagion but because they sensed something clinging to me now, something unseen yet real, the echo of a scream that had crossed a threshold it should never have touched. They did not call me cursed. They did not speak the word, but I saw it in their eyes. I felt it in their silence. And silence, I learned, can be sharper than any blade. At first, it was the screams that haunted me. The shrieks of men flayed by labor, the guttural cries torn from throats when bones shattered beneath iron weight, the wailing of mothers as their children starved to pale husks beside them. Those sounds carved themselves into my memory like acid on parchment. They followed me even into sleep, echoing down corridors of half-dream, breaking through the thin fabric of forgetfulness. But over the years, the screams faded. Not because the suffering lessened, no, it never lessened. The lash still sang, the chains still tore skin. The machine still consumed bodies and spat out husks. The cruelty of this place did not abate, did not soften. What changed was us. One by one, the voices fell silent. I remember the day I noticed it. A man beside me, a giant of flesh whose back had borne burdens greater than my own, was struck across the leg by a falling beam of steel. The impact shattered him. I heard the crack of bone, saw the white splinter pierce through his skin. His body folded, twisted beneath the weight, blood pouring down his shin in sheets. I waited for the inevitable howl of agony, the desperate plea for release. But none came. His jaw clenched. His lips trembled. His eyes burned with pain, yes, but no sound escaped. He dragged himself out from beneath the beam in silence, blood trailing behind him, and went back to work until the life drained from him hours later. His body simply collapsed where he stood, and the overseers stepped over him without pause. It struck me then. The silence had become the law. I began to notice it everywhere. The lash would split a back open, no scream. A child, no more than 6, would waste away into a husk of skin and ribs, no cry. Limbs torn in machinery, eyes gouged by sparks of plasma, faces burned to bubbling ruin, no one raised their voice. The silence swallowed it all, and in that silence I felt something worse than fear. I felt the erasure of what it meant to be human. At night, when I lay on the stone floor of the barracks, the only sounds were the hiss of respirators feeding oxygen into poisoned lungs, and the endless drone of machinery, deep, metallic, steady, like a heart that was not ours, a heart that beat for the Imperium alone. The silence of the living pressed down harder than the screams of the dying ever had. For in the absence of cries, in the absence of protest, all that remained was submission. The silence itself became a language. It told the overseers that we were broken. It told the emperor's priests that faith had been burned into us like a brand. It told each other that there was no point, no escape, no hope. When I looked into the hollow eyes of my fellow workers, I saw that silence reflected back at me a deadened acceptance, as if their souls had been carved out and replaced with obedience. We did not need to speak. We did not need to cry. Our silence told the story of our unmaking. I remember watching a woman cradle her child as it starved in her arms. The babe's lips moved faintly, no sound left in its tiny lungs. The woman's face was stone. No wail, no sob, not even when its body went limp. She merely laid the corpse aside, her hands already blistered and raw from labor, and continued her task. The silence around her was heavier than any shriek could have been. Even the priests who came among us seemed unsettled by it. They chanted the litanies, their vox amplifiers filling the halls with hollow prayers, but the silence of our bodies swallowed their words like water consuming sparks. They demanded responses, demanded we speak the emperor's name aloud, but our lips stayed shut. Not out of defiance, not even out of fatigue, but because the silence had grown inside us, coiling like roots through our flesh, until to break it felt like a blasphemy greater than any heresy. I began to wonder which was worse, the agony that once found voice or this quiet, suffocating void. The answer came to me slowly, across years that bled together into a gray haze. Screams are honest. Screams are human. They prove the soul still fights, still resists, still cries out to the void for some answer even if none comes. Screams are the sound of defiance, even in despair. But silence is surrender. It is the sound of graves filled before death has come. It is the sound of obedience so absolute that the body itself denies its own suffering. The overseers encouraged it. They never said it aloud, never declared it policy. But I could see it in their eyes, the satisfaction when a man lost his hand in a cog grinder and did not wail, the approval when a woman's legs were crushed beneath ore and she worked on until her last breath without a whimper. In silence, we became perfect tools, efficient, predictable, broken. And yet, silence does not erase pain. I know this because I carried it within me, a weight heavier than any chain. Each lash that tore my skin, each hunger pang that gnawed my belly, each moment of watching others die wordlessly beside me, the silence pressed it all inward. With no release, no cry, no sound, the pain burrowed deeper, sinking into marrow and thought, into dream and memory. Sometimes I would wake in the night and feel my jaw aching from how tightly I had clenched it in sleep. My throat burned as though screams had tried to claw their way free and found themselves trapped within. My chest would heave with the phantom of sobs I never allowed myself to utter. The silence did not take the pain away. It buried it. And what is buried does not die. It festers. It grows. It waits. Even now, when I recall those years, I remember not the sound of agony but the crushing absence of it. A hall filled with men and women bent beneath loads that broke their spines, but no voices raised, no cries, only the rasp of breath and the hum of machines. That was the song of our lives. The hiss of respirators, the drone of engines, the shuffle of boots against stone. Nothing more. The silence stretched across decades. It became the air we breathed. And in its depths I began to feel the tremor of something else, something vast, unseen, coiling in the spaces where our voices once lived. Because silence cannot last forever. It does not erase pain, it only drives it deeper. And when pain is driven deep enough, it does not vanish. It breaks through, in another form. I used to believe that silence meant the end of pain, that once the throat refused to yield, once the voice broke and faded into stillness, there would be peace. I was wrong. The screams do not die when they cease to pass through flesh and breath. They do not wither like smoke rising into nothingness. They go somewhere. I know this now. Perhaps I have always known, but denial is a soft cloth the Imperium rips from our hands the moment we dare reach for it. Every cry of anguish, every guttural wail torn from lungs too small, too weak, too desperate, becomes another thread woven into an endless tapestry of torment. Those sounds, those last fragments of defiance or despair, are devoured by the warp, and the warp does not forget. I have seen psychers seize in their chains, eyes rolled back until only white showed, shrieking with words that were not their own. They said they could hear the crying, not just the crying of now, but of all that ever was. They spoke of echoes layered so thickly that they formed walls of grief, rising higher than palaces, stretching wider than continents. A single scream may fade from human memory, but in that other realm it festers and it breeds. It is a terrible paradox. To cry out is to be marked. The overseers, the priests, the commissars, they all teach us this. Pain must be swallowed, because the emperor grants endurance, and endurance is the proof of loyalty. To break that silence is to shame him, to betray the faith he demands. And yet, not crying does not spare you. It does not vanish into mercy. The silence itself is swallowed, becoming fodder for terrors beyond comprehension. The warp feasts on sound and its absence alike. There is no escape. I learned this too late. I remember the first scream I ever heard as though it had been etched into the marrow of my bones. It was a child's voice, ragged and high, ripped apart by fear more than by injury. I thought it would end once her body was still. It did not. Even now, long years after the girl's face has rotted from memory, her cry remains. It stalks me. It lingers just beyond the edge of silence, like a note struck and held forever. Sometimes, when I close my eyes in the dark, I hear it more clearly than I hear my own heartbeat. It is not memory. Memory fades. This does not. This is eternal. And I wonder if my own voice, the one I locked away inside me all those years, is still screaming too. Perhaps it never stopped. Perhaps every word I did not dare speak has gone on without me, cast adrift into that howling abyss beyond stars. If the warp hungers for sound, then I have fed it more than I will ever know. You must understand this is the true punishment. Not the lashes, not the starvation, not the overseer's pistol pressed to the skull of a companion chosen at random. The true punishment is knowing there is no right choice. Cry and you are condemned. Remain silent and you are condemned. Suffering is the only constant and the galaxy drinks it greedily. Some whisper that demons are made of such things. That every claw, every horn, every dripping maw is shaped by human agony given form. If that is true, then the Imperium itself is the greatest artisan of hell, sculpting horrors from its own people, one stifled scream at a time. Perhaps this is why they demand silence, not to spare us but to feed them more completely. I have walked through hab blocks where thousands lived in endless quiet, broken only by the drone of machinery and the shuffle of half-dead feet. Not a voice lifted, not a sob, not even the sigh of a dying elder. Yet I felt the weight pressing in from every wall as though the unspoken pain vibrated in the very steel. Silence does not erase suffering. It compacts it, condenses it, until it is denser than stone, sharper than blades. It seeps into you. It fills your lungs, and suddenly you realize you are breathing other people's despair. You taste it on your tongue, sour and metallic like old blood. And you understand, the silence is not empty, it is full, too full. That is what the warp drinks. Not just the noise, but the crushing fullness behind it. And when you hear demons laugh, you will recognize the sound. It is the sound of every scream you ever buried, exhaled back at you with teeth and claws. They are not foreign creatures. They are mirrors, grotesque and swollen with the very anguish we thought we had concealed. Tell me, then, what path is left, to speak or to withhold, to cry or to endure? Both roads end in the same place. Both bleed into the same abyss. There is no salvation in noise, no redemption in silence. The galaxy devours us either way, and so I live with the cry that never ends. It follows me down corridors lit by flickering lumen strips. It clings to me in the cold hours between shifts. It coils itself into my thoughts as I kneel before the statues of saints I no longer believe in. Even when others around me keep their mouths shut, I hear the echoes. Not theirs, not mine, but all of them, stretching across centuries, screaming and screaming without pause. Sometimes, in my more fragile hours, I wonder if the galaxy itself is built upon those cries. If every star burns brighter because of them. If every shadow is darker because of them. Perhaps the Emperor's throne, cold and unyielding, is cushioned only by the endless sobs of his children. I do not know if I fear this truth or if I have already gone beyond fear, but I will leave you with this. In this universe, whether you scream or whether you remain silent, you are heard. Always. The galaxy listens. The galaxy answers, and its answer is never mercy.